does so much and confirms what the Bible teaches in so many ways. And yet, there is this narrative that science is somehow against the Bible. We hear that science has proved millions of years of evolution. It hasn't. That's what I want to talk about today. But that has become a stumbling block for people to really understand and receive and believe the gospel, because they think the Bible's been disproved by science in its first chapter. You see, if millions of years of evolution is the way that life came about, with animals killing other animals for vast periods of time, and then finally humans evolved, then death has always been a part of the world. And yet the Bible says that death is the enemy, an enemy that was introduced as a result of our sin. If evolution's true, then death is not the penalty for sin. It's something that's always existed. And if death's not the penalty for sin, then why did Jesus have to die on the cross? You see how the gospel message is undermined by this belief in evolution. And so this narrative that science supports evolution is something that we must counter as Christians. And I want to show you some information today that will help you to do that. Think of this as conversation starters. Now tonight I'm going to give you a conversation ender. I'm going to show you how you can refute evolution definitively and demonstrate that creation is necessarily, logically true. It has to be. But this morning, conversation starter. You might wonder, how is it that with all this evidence for creation, that there are people who believe in Darwinian evolution? It has nothing to do with the evidence. It has to do with the way we look at the evidence. We all have, as it were, mental lenses through which we observe the world that help us to draw conclusions about the world. Evolutionists, secularists, when they look at the world, already have in their mind the idea of millions of years of slow, gradual processes producing Earth's features. They reject the idea of a global flood, which is God's judgment on the earth, and instead they think in terms of slow, gradual processes resulting in life on earth over millions of years. Now, I don't blame secularists for having a worldview. I have one too. The difference is mine's right? Because I start with Scripture. I start with the Word of God, which gives us the true history of the universe, beginning with a perfect creation that we ruined. We introduced death into the world when we rebelled against God in Adam. And that is why we need the gospel today. We need someone to pay for our sins and change our nature. And that's something only Christ can do. But when we look at the world through the lens of the history of Scripture, we find that the evidence makes sense. We're going to look at 3 different fields of science today. I'm going to start with genetics. I'm going to spend the most time on that, which is the study of how animals change, how traits are passed on from one generation to the next. That's genetics. We're going to look briefly at information theory, which some of you may never have heard of, but it's very fascinating and very confirmatory of biblical creation. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on geology, time permitting. So let's jump in and talk about genetics, the study of heredity, the study of how animals change. Do animals change? Do dogs, for example, change from one generation to the next? Do they? Yeah. What do they change into? Dogs. Yeah, dogs change into dogs. Now that's not evolution, that's just dogs. But God has built into organisms the ability to diversify from one generation to the next. But they remain the same kind. And that's what we'd expect, because the Bible teaches that God made animals according to their kinds, or after their kind, a phrase that's used 10 times in Genesis. We better take it seriously. A kind is the reproductive limit of an organism, because God brought 2 of each kind on board Noah's Ark, you see. So, animals remain the same kind, but they can diversify within kinds. And so you can get lots of different varieties of dogs from just 2, but they will always be dogs. Cats, you can get different varieties of cats by selectively breeding them, but they will always be cats, unfortunately. Okay? It's important to recognize that kind does not mean species. Those are different words. Species is a modern word. It does not mean the same thing as kind. You can get multiple species from one kind. There's a group of mosquitoes that's separated from the parent population for like 100 years, and then its descendants are brought back, and they are no longer able to interbreed with the originals, and so they're classified as a new species of mosquito, but they're still mosquitoes, and unfortunately they always will be. Kind does not mean species. Unfortunately, evolutionists sometimes misrepresent what it is that creationists teach, and they'll claim that, well, creationists believe that God created all the animals as we see them today. That is not true. I don't believe that God created poodles in the Garden of Eden, right? It was a paradise. You're not going to have poodles running around, right? He did create dogs, but there's been diversification over time. So that is not what we believe. What we actually believe is more like this: variation within a kind. Yes, you can get the different varieties of dogs, but they remain the same kinds. Some kinds have gone extinct. We no longer have the dinosaurs. Some kinds, certain varieties have gone extinct, where other varieties of the same kind remain. Mammoths, for example, we believe are part of the elephant kind, but they're not around anymore, whereas elephants are. The Asian and the African elephants, and they're related. So that's what we truly believe. On the other hand, if evolution were true, then there's really only one kind, because everything's related. You're related to broccoli in the evolutionary worldview. That's your distant cousin. Now, I don't believe that, but that is what they believe. And to see which of these views is most consistent with science, we need to learn about DNA. This is a very long molecule that occurs in the cells of your body. It looks like a twisted ladder, and on the rungs of this ladder are chemicals called nucleotide base pairs. And there are 4 different varieties: C, G, A, and T. It's the first letter of each. We usually use those letters to represent them. And on a given strand, you don't know which letter is going to come next. C, G, A, T, C, C, whatever, you don't know. And depending on how those letters are arranged, they spell out the information to make you. Pretty amazing. So those letters are encoding the instructions to make your physical form, perhaps even your personality to some extent. Much the way you could spell help with beads on a rope, so you can spell out the information to make a person in DNA. And the reason you're a person and not a cabbage is you have instructions to make a person, and a cabbage has instructions to make a cabbage. And you got the better deal on that one, believe me. Now, to make things even more interesting, you have 2 sets of DNA. And your parents had 2 sets of DNA, and their parents had 2 sets of DNA. And a section of DNA that controls a trait is called a gene. And so we've colored different sections of DNA to represent genes there. And it's actually the combination of the 2 genes on your 2 different sets of DNA that determines a trait. And so they can determine eye color and hair color and so on. That's why we all have little differences, because some of our genes are different, and they encode different instructions. What's interesting is when mom and dad have children, each child gets only one of the 2 genes from each parent, but there's 2 parents, and so they end up with a new set of DNA with half the information from each parent. So the first child gets those genes, the next child gets these ones, the next child gets those genes, and the last child gets those ones. And so you might notice you look a little like your brothers and sisters, but you have some differences as well. That's because you have a unique combination of DNA. Unless you have an identical twin, your combination is different from your siblings. But you still got the information from your parents. It's just you have a unique combination. Isn't that a brilliant way of encoding all the variation to make us? Because if you think about it, all the instructions to make everyone in this room were encoded in the DNA of Adam and Eve. God had you in mind when he put those DNA instructions in Adam and Eve. That's something to think about. And the number of unique combinations of DNA, you take 2 parents, you take a typical couple, the number of unique offspring they could have, statistically, is greater than the number of atoms in the universe. It's a very clever way of generating tremendous variety within the human race. Now, here it is with blood type. There's 4 different blood types in human beings: A, B, AB, and O. And if you have if you get the A gene from mom and the A gene from dad, you have AA, your blood type is A. If you get the A from one parent and the O from another, your blood type is still A, because A is dominant and O is recessive. Maybe you remember doing that in school. The way you get blood type B is either BB or B and O. Now, if you get an A from one parent and a B from the other, your blood type is AB, and because they're codominant. The only way you can have blood type O is to have the O from each parent. So OO, that generates the blood type O. So those are the 4 blood types in human beings. What I find interesting is that if mom has blood type A and dad has blood type B, and let's say it's the heterozygous variety where you have A and O, B and O, okay, then the children could have any possible blood type. One child could get the A gene from mom and the O from dad and have blood type A. The next could get the B from dad, the O from mom, and have blood type B. The next could get the A from mom, the B from dad, and have blood type AB. And then one could get the O from mom and one the O from dad and have blood type O. Interesting. So the first child says, I have blood type A, just like mom. The next child says, I have blood type B, just like dad. The fourth child says, I have blood type O. Am I adopted? No, you're not. You still got the information from your parents. It simply wasn't expressed. And so all the variation for all the different traits we have was built into the instructions in Adam and Eve. Really amazing. Very brilliant. Here it is with skin shade. People talk about skin color, but we all really have the same skin color, brown. It's just a question of how much. There's a pigment called melanin, a couple different forms of it. And if you have the capital letters there, you tend to produce a lot of melanin. If you have the lowercase, you produce very little. This is simplified, but that's the basic principle there. Now, if you're in that upper left-hand box with all the capital letters and you get married to somebody in that upper box, your kids will be in that box too, because those are the only letters available. And likewise, if you're in the lower right and you get married to somebody in the lower right, your kids will be in that box as well. That's very common. But if you're in the upper right box, which has capital A, lower a, capital B, lowercase b, and you get married to somebody in that box, your kids could have any skin shade from very dark to very light. And so we think Adam and Eve probably had a middle brown skin color, and so they would have had tremendous variety in their offspring. Now we're going to take a look at dogs and the variation within dogs, because dogs have a lot of variety, a lot of heterozygosity, big A, big B, little b, that kind of stuff. And dogs reproduce quickly, so we can see whether they confirm creation or evolution. Now it seems to me that if evolution is true, then something like bacteria, as they reproduced over millions of years, gave rise to something like a horse, right? That's the story. But bacteria have certain instructions in their DNA. A horse has a lot more information in its DNA because it's a more complex critter. For example, a horse has information to make bones. A horse has information to make eyeballs and feet, limbs, and so on. Bacteria do not have those instructions, and they can't produce those features as a result. They don't have that information in their DNA. So it seems to me that if bacteria evolved into horses, at some point they had to gain brand new genetic information. Isn't that obvious? Evolution requires new genetic information in order to work. It would have to, because bacteria do not have instructions. They don't have information to produce bones and eyes. Horses do. So if evolution can't get new information, it can't happen. That's my point. And that's interesting, because the processes we observe scientifically do not increase information. In fact, they usually reduce it, or are perhaps neutral. But we don't know of any scientific process that produces brand new information in the genome, which would indicate science is on the side of creation, God having put those original instructions in Adam and Eve, and we've lost some sense that we haven't gained any new information. Let me show you how this works with a common example, natural selection. A lot of people think natural selection is evolution, but it's not, because evolution requires you to increase information in the DNA. Natural selection is the opposite. Let me show you how this works. Suppose you have two dogs, male and a female, And each has a gene for short fur and a gene for long fur. And suppose those genes are codominant, and so the dogs have medium length fur. This is simplified, but the basic genetic principle here is true. Now, when those dogs have pups, some of the pups are going to get the short gene from mom and the short gene from dad, and they will have short fur. Some dogs will get the short gene from one parent, the long gene from other, and they will have medium length fur, just like their parents. Statistically, 50% of the offspring would have that combination. And then some dogs will get the long gene from mom and the long gene from dad, and they will have very long fur. And so in one generation, you can have quite a lot of variety. This is a great example of variation within a kind. But there's no evolution yet, because we started with dogs, we ended up with dogs, and we haven't gained any new information. We started with information for short and long, and by combination medium, and we ended up with dogs that express those traits, but there's no new information. They still have S, L, and SL, right? Well, suppose the environment gets very cold. What's going to happen? The dogs that have the shorter and medium length fur, well, they don't do so well in a cold environment, and so sadly, they die, right? They're not well insulated against the cold. Granted, that's a worst case scenario, but maybe they can't, they have to spend all their time finding shelter, and so they're not able to meet other dogs and reproduce. The dogs that are most comfortable in a cold environment have the long fur, and they meet other dogs that have long fur, and when they reproduce dogs with long fur. Yeah, and you can see that's the only combination possible at that point. And so, have we increased the genetic information? No, we started with information for short and long, and by combination medium, and we ended up with information just for long. You see, natural selection doesn't increase information in the DNA, it reduces it. Because it refers to the death of organisms that can't compete in that particular environment. Now, if we started the experiment over, and we have all three varieties, and this time, let's suppose the environment gets very hot. Well, now what's going to happen? Well, the dogs with the longer fur, they don't do well in a hot environment, and so sadly they die of heat stroke. They can't compete. The dogs that thrive in a hot environment are those that have the shorter, thinner fur. And they meet other dogs that have survived, and when they reproduce, they'll reproduce dogs with short fur. Exactly. Again, is this evolution? Well, no. No, it's a great example of adaptation. This is one type of adaptation. The environment got hot, and the dogs ended up with genes for short fur, right? And it's not that the individual dogs decided, gee, it's getting hot, I better reduce my fur. No. The dogs already had that trait, and it happened to benefit them in that environment, and so they survived better and reproduced in greater abundance than the dogs that had the longer fur. But there's been no new information. In fact, we've lost information. We've lost the information for long fur. It's gone. And so natural selection is the opposite of evolution. Darwin thought that he could convince people of evolution by persuading them of natural selection, because natural selection is easily demonstrated. But what you need to realize is that they are the exact opposite. Natural selection is in the opposite direction of evolution. It's a downhill process. Evolution is an uphill process, gaining brand new information. But this is how we end up with dogs in cold climates that have long fur. If they didn't, they wouldn't be there. They would have died. Or dogs in very hot climates with short fur, and so on. Dogs in the wild, anyway. And so you don't need two of each breed of dog on Noah's Ark. You can get these varieties later. So you don't need 2 Dalmatians and 2 Border Collies and 2 Golden Retrievers. You certainly don't need 2 poodles on board Noah's Ark. You just need 2 dogs. And they get off and they have a lot of heterozygosity, big A, little a, big B, little b. And they spread away from the mountains of Ararat, and they carry certain traits with them. And if the genes they carry with them produce traits conducive to survival in that environment, then they thrive in that environment. And so sure enough, we find dogs in cold climates have thicker, longer fur. Dogs in hot environments in the wild have thinner, shorter fur. Great example of natural selection. But it's not evolution, because we haven't gained any new information. We've actually lost information. And so this is how we account for the different wild dogs that we find in the world. It's just the various combinations of DNA that God put in the dog kind, and whether those produce traits conducive to survival in that environment, in which case they thrive. But it doesn't involve any new information, so it's not evolution. You're never going to turn a dog into anything other than a dog by killing some of the varieties of dog. That's all natural selection is. But my secular colleagues would say, oh, but Dr. Lisle, it's not just natural selection, it's natural selection and mutations. So what's a mutation? A mutation is a mistake in your DNA. It sometimes happens when the DNA is being copied. As animals reproduce, sometimes a mistake can happen, and you end up with a dog that's got some problems, okay? All dogs should have instructions to produce 4 normal, healthy legs, but there is a mutation that causes some instructions to be lost, and therefore the dog ends up with short, stubby little legs. No, this is not evolution, though, because he's not gained new information. He's lost some information, and therefore his legs don't form properly. Now, if you think about it, a dog like that is not going to do very well in the wild, is he? He can't run very fast on those short, stubby little legs. He can't catch anything. He's probably more likely to be caught by something else because he can't run very fast. And so in nature, mutations tend to be weeded out to some extent because the animals that have them have a tendency to die, sadly. In fact, there are some mutations that are immediately lethal, that cause the heart not to develop properly. And you need a heart to live. So if you get that mutation, you're going to die, which means you're not going to pass it on. So in nature, mutations are reduced somewhat. Some of them are immediately eliminated, and then some are just really inconvenient. And so the dog has a chance of surviving, but life is going to be hard for that little guy, sadly, because of those short little legs. But some people like dogs with short, stubby little legs because they can't jump up on you as much. And so people will take these little mutants into their household, right? And they can feed them and spend millions of dollars trying to keep the thing alive, right? And so that dog doesn't have to survive in the wild because he has a human caretaker that can take care of all his needs. So there you go, right? And that's why domestic breeds of dogs tend to be full of mutations. They really do. There's a mutation that causes a dog's snout not to form properly. A dog's supposed to have a long snout, and that helps with its ability to smell. There's a mutation that causes the snout to be short, but the jaw was designed to fit the longer snout, so it has a horrible underbite. And the skin was designed to fit the longer snout, so the skin hangs off the side. And some people think that's cute. You think the dog says, gee, I love having 9-year-old stuff in my face. That's great. Perhaps not. For example, poodles have some problems. They really do, as a result of some of these mutations or a secondary result. For example, we talked about the genes for fur length, right? With poodles, that gene is damaged, and they can't regulate their hair growth. The poodle's hair grows forever. They can't stop it, which is why you will never see a poodle in the wild, ever. Because after a while, you just have a big poof ball. There's no way they can survive trying to drag all that hair behind them. That's why you'll never see a National Geographic special, behold that mighty poodle stalks his pride. Never gonna happen, right? Never gonna happen. If you see a poodle, it has a human caretaker who gives it a haircut every now and then. Yes, you have to do that. If you don't, by the way, the hair can get into their eyes and they can get infected, they can go blind. Poodles tend to suffer from that, or it can go to their ears and cause problems there. So they really do. They're very cute. I'm not anti-poodle, but they do have problems because of mutations. So here's the lesson, folks. Mutations, they don't give you superpowers. They give you problems. They really do. And so this is how we account for the different breeds of domestic dogs. It's the information God planted in the dog varieties, along with mutations, mistakes that have removed some of that information. And that's why domestic breeds tend to have some problems. They really do. But it's not a brand new kind of animal. It's not improving. It's a downhill process, and that's my point. So by the way, we think the dogs that were on Noah's Ark would have been more like the wolf variety because they have a lot of heterozygosity. Big A, little a, big B, little b. And by selectively breeding them, it kind of concentrates the mutations. And you're more likely to suffer a disease until you get down to the poodle, and that's kind of it. right? It's kind of the bottom of the line there. But the point is, you're not gaining any new information. This is not evolution. It's in the wrong direction. Evolution is supposed to be about increasing information. Mutations and natural selection decrease information. That's all they do. Mutations just do it faster. When I'm teaching this to youngsters, I like to say that the information in your DNA is a lot like jelly beans. And the wild kinds of dogs, lots of information, lots of jelly beans. And as you selectively breed them, it concentrates the mutations, which remove that information until you get down to the poodle. That's kind of it, right? That's the bottom line of the dog world. Now, can you ever turn a dog into a cat by removing jelly beans? And the answer is no, because a cat has Jolly Ranchers. It's got different information. You see the point there? Yes, you can get different breeds of dogs by removing information, but you'll never turn a dog into a cat because it has different information. I do have to point out that some of the information, some of the genes between dogs and cats are the same, and that's important because we use some of the same proteins. So you have some of the same DNA as a banana. That's true. That's not because of evolution. It's because God knew that you would enjoy eating bananas, and therefore they produce some of the same proteins that your body needs to function. God theoretically could have made all organisms with totally different DNA, then we'd have totally different proteins, which means the only thing we'd be able to eat is other humans. That would not have been good. God knew what he was doing. He really did. So we see that when dogs reproduce, they reproduce dogs. That's exactly what we'd expect, because God made organisms according to their kinds. That's not a problem. And God has built into dogs heterozygosity, big A, little a, big B, little b, right? And so you can get lots of different varieties. If you want a short-haired dog, we can do that for you. You want a long-haired dog, we can do that for you. You want a dog with floppy ears, we can do that for you. You want a dog with feathers, you're out of luck. Because God did not put that information in the dog kind. It's not there, and it never will be. Because natural selection and mutations only remove information. This is good observational science. It's something we can test in the present, and it confirms biblical creation. It does not confirm millions of years of evolution, which would require brand new genetic information. I do have to point out that mutations can be beneficial by losing information. So there are mutations that under certain circumstances will help an organism to survive. But my point is, it's still the opposite of evolution. Evolutionists like to say, well, there are occasional good mutations that help an organism survive. That is true, but they're still in the opposite direction to make evolution work. For example, I'll just give you one example today for time's sake. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So there's a bacterium called H. pylori, which causes stomach ulcers, and you don't like that. So you go to your doctor, and he gives you an antibiotic. And the antibiotic, which your cells cannot process, goes into the bacterium, and he's got an enzyme that his system produces that when it interacts with that antibiotic, it converts it into a poison, and the poison kills the bacterium, and you feel better, okay? There is a mutated form of H. pylori that lacks the ability to produce that enzyme, or at least not very much of it. And so the antibiotic goes into him, and it just sits there. He can't convert it into a poison because he's missing the instructions for that particular enzyme. And so he survives, but he survives because he's lost some information. And this is how you end up with resistant strains of bacteria. Hospitals have to deal with these sometimes. And so this is why you don't overprescribe antibiotics, by the way. It leads to resistant strains. And it's not because the bacteria decided he needed to become resistant. He was already resistant. And you kill off all the normal ones, you see. But it's not evolution because you're not producing anything other than a bacterium, and you're not improving him. He's lost some instructions. He hasn't gained new instructions. You can never turn a bacterium into a horse this way. It's not going to happen. Dr. Lisle, PhD, biophysics, Johns Hopkins University, says all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. Isn't that interesting? Mutations, according to Dr. Spetner, are always in the wrong direction to make evolution happen. They don't increase information. He says not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. Now, there are different types of mutations. There are mutations called duplications, where a section of DNA gets copied, so you have 2 copies now. And evolutionists see, there you have more information. Do you? If a paragraph in a newspaper got duplicated, do you have any more information? No, you couldn't learn anything from the second paragraph. You couldn't learn from the original because they're identical. It might make the newspaper article longer. Yeah, there are mutations that make the DNA longer, but they don't add brand new information. So you see, when we take a look at genetics and we study it, we find that it's very consistent with biblical creation. God created the original information in organisms, and some has been lost over time due to natural selection and mutations, but we haven't gained any new information. Whereas evolution would teach, no, the way we came about is by information increasing mutations. But that's not what we observe, folks. Not scientifically. Science is on the side of creation, isn't it? Well, we've been talking about information. There's an entire field called information theory dedicated to understanding information, how it's transmitted, and so on. Very important in our computer age. Well, what is information? I mean, we kind of have a feeling for it, but how would you define it? Well, Dr. Werner Gitt, one of the world's experts on information theory, and a very good Christian man, by the way. I've met him and chatted with him. He's a neat guy. He has, basically, I'm summarizing his results. He's defined information in terms of these three criteria. First of all, information always entails a symbolic code system. And so if you pick up a book, it has information in it. You'll see a word like house. Now, you're not seeing an actual house. You're seeing a word that represents the object, right? And so that's a code system. Words represent other things. That's a code system. There's always language. A book will have sentences and paragraphs. The sentences will have a subject and a predicate. They'll have nouns and verbs and so on. So that's language. Wouldn't have to be English, but there would be a language there. And then finally, there's meaning. You can learn something by reading this book. It's not just random sentences of nonsense. It means something. There's an expected action on the part of the reader. And the writer of the book had a purpose in writing it. Consider a cookbook, for example. A cookbook fulfills these criteria, doesn't it? Because a cookbook has a symbolic code system. Is it 3 teaspoons of sugar? Okay, it represents that. There's a language there. It's stir thoroughly. It's telling you what to do. And then there's meaning. There's an expected action that the person reading the book will combine the ingredients in that way. And there's a purpose that you won't go hungry. You see, so a cookbook fulfills this criteria, which means a cookbook does have information in it. The Bible has information in it. It fulfills these criteria as well. Really, any book you can think of does have information in it. Could this be information? Well, remember the criteria: symbolic code system, language, meaning. Is there a symbolic code system? Sure looks like it. It looks like those are icons that represent something. Is there language? Well, it looks like it's organized into sentences. It looks like there's a language there. Is there meaning? That's the tricky one. You have to know what the symbols mean to know if there's meaning. But fortunately, I know what the symbols mean. This is Genesis 1 through 5 in the form of icons. So you have in the beginning, see the movie clipboard, like in the beginning of a movie, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Isn't that neat? It's Genesis 1 through 5 in the form of icons. Pretty neat. Now, once you identify that something has information, there are certain laws of nature that apply. Just like when you identify that there's energy in a system, there are laws that deal with energy, like the law of conservation of energy, which says information can't be created nor destroyed. Well, there are laws that deal with information, and Dr. Werner Gitt has written about them. And one of these laws is that information never spontaneously generates in matter. Werner Gitt says there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. What does that mean? Well, basically, if you have a bowl of alphabet soup and you stir it up, you're not going to get Shakespeare or the instructions on how to operate a microwave, okay? You might get a word like cat, but that's it. You're not going to get meaningful sentences that have structure and have an expected action and intended purpose. So that's intuitive, right? Well, where does information come from? Ultimately, it comes from a mind. Dr. Gitt says, when its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. That's intuitive, isn't it? Now, I have to point out, non-mental processes can copy information. Oh, a Xerox machine can copy information, but it can't create new information. It can't create a brand new story. You can, because you have a mind. And so whenever you pick up a book, you know if it's got creative information in it that somebody wrote that book. It wouldn't occur to you to think, well, this book probably came about when a typewriter exploded, right? You know that it comes from a mind originally. Yeah, and maybe not that specific copy. The particular book you have was probably made by a machine that makes lots of them simultaneously, but it had to get its information from a computer, which got its information from another computer, which got its information ultimately from a mind. Information always originates in a mind. Yes? Intuitive? Easy? Well, that's interesting, because in DNA we have information. The information to make you is encoded in your DNA. Where did you get it? You got it from your parents. They got it from their parents. That information has been copied by these cellular machines, enzymes that are not intelligent, but they've been designed to do that. You have little Xerox machines in the cells of your body that copy DNA, but it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, and they got that information from God, the mind of God. So you see, creation is consistent with information theory. Evolution is not. Because evolution, the evolutionist claims that all the information in your DNA came about by mutations, which are not a mind. They're accidents. But we've never observed that. We've never observed information coming about by chance. It always comes from the mind. And by the way, in their heart of hearts, evolutionists do know that information comes from the mind. Yes, they do. I did a social experiment years ago where I posted an article called On the Origin of Articles, which is a play on Darwin's book. And this article is a satire. It tries to convince you that articles have no authors. Well, where do articles come from? Well, they're a series of copying mistakes, most of which make the article worse, but occasionally a typo makes the article better, and those are preserved and passed on. And so articles evolve over millions of years of typos. That's ridiculous, right? Well, the funny thing was not so much the article, but the responses I got to it. I can't tell you how many evolutionists chimed in and said, "We know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle." And I'm like, "How do you know that? Did you see me write it? Oh, you're taking it on faith? Oh, that's interesting. Okay." But we can trace it back to the IP address and prove that you wrote it. That would prove that I posted it, but I admit to posting it. When this thing evolved on my computer, it was too good not to share it. Right? But they kept arguing with it. Of course, I was playing the part of an evolutionist, and they were playing the part of a creationist. It was funny to see them do that. And I would point out, you must be one of those authorists that believes that articles have authors. If you want to believe that, okay, but keep it in church, man. I'm not interested. And it was fun. It was fun to play with them a little bit. Now, any one of them could easily have refuted me. They could have. All they'd have to do is say, "We know that you or someone wrote that article because it has information in it." And information always requires a mind. And that would have shut me up. Not one of them did that. Not one of them made that argument. You know why? Because then they'd have to admit evolution's wrong. That the information in their DNA came from a mind and is not the result of evolution. Isn't that interesting? These critics would rather be reduced to foolishness than bow the knee to Christ. And their responses were foolish. And by the way, if you go to this article on the website, you can read not only the article, but their responses to it and my interactions with them. It is a lot of fun. It'll be a fun afternoon for you if you do that, believe me. But yeah, they do know in their heart of hearts that information only comes from the mind. Well, I need to touch on geology here a little bit. The bottom line is the rock layers that we find around the world are very consistent with biblical creation and a worldwide flood. The flood deposited lots of sedimentary rock layers. It killed organisms and buried them within those rock layers. See, evolutionists reject the worldwide flood because they want to argue that these fossils were deposited gradually over hundreds of millions of years. And the way they try to defend that these days is radiometric dating. And so that's what I want to talk about. Take a few minutes and talk about this. Radiometric dating is a way to try and make a guess about the age of a rock. And people have misconceptions about it. They think, well, don't scientists measure age? I mean, they hold the rock, point their tricorder at it, and it measures the age, right? No. What they're measuring are isotope ratios. Let me show you how this works. We're all made up of atoms, these little particles that have protons and neutrons in the nucleus and electrons circling around, and they stick together under certain circumstances. Pretty amazing. Certain atoms are what we call radioactive or unstable, the same meaning, which means they will spontaneously change into another type of atom, emitting energy as they do so. For example, uranium-238 is radioactive. It will spontaneously emit energy and turn into thorium, which is also radioactive. And so it will decay into the next element, which decays into the next, and so on, all the way down to lead-206. And lead-206 is not radioactive. It is stable. It will remain lead-206 forever or until the Lord returns. Okay? So now only a small fraction of atoms are radioactive. So you're not going to change into anything in the next 24 hours. But there are a small fraction that do, and they're found in rocks. We find rocks with uranium-238 in them. And we know the rate at which it changes into lead. Now you don't know, for an individual atom, you don't know when it's going to change. It seems to be random. But if you have a lot of atoms, you know that statistically, after a certain amount of time, a certain fraction of them will have changed. It's kind of like popcorn. You don't know when the next kernel is going to pop or which one's going to pop next, but you do know that after about 2.5 minutes in the microwave, it's done. Okay? It's the same way with uranium-238, and we know that in a year, a certain fraction of it has changed. And so for all of it to change into lead would theoretically take billions of years. So the bottom line is if you had a chunk of solid uranium and you waited for a long time, you'd have some uranium, some lead, and then eventually you'd have all lead. And that theoretically would take billions of years. Now we find rocks with some uranium and some lead in them. And it's very tempting to use that as a clock to figure out, you might think, well, when the rock was all uranium. But how do you know it was all uranium to start with? How do you know it didn't have some lead in it to begin with? How do you know I didn't make that rock yesterday in a laboratory with a lot of lead in it? You don't, right? You don't ultimately know that. You can think of the uranium changing into lead like the sand going from the top chamber to the bottom chamber in an hourglass. And you can use an hourglass to tell time if you make the right assumptions. Suppose when you came into this room, I had an hourglass that looked like that, and it was standing there, and I asked you, how long ago do you think I turned that over? And you'd say, well, it's an hourglass, and it looks like it's about halfway done. I'd say about a half an hour. And I'd say, I gotcha. Because actually I turned it over 1 minute ago, but already a lot of the sand was in the bottom chamber. Oh, you assumed that all the sand started in the top chamber. That's like assuming that all the lead was originally uranium. You don't know that. That's an assumption. How do you know somebody didn't add sand when you weren't looking? Uranium is leachable in salt water. It can move in and out of rocks under certain circumstances. How do you know the throat of the bottle's always been the same size so that the sand has always flown at the same rate? That's probably a safe assumption for an hourglass. But for radioactive decay, we don't know exactly why radioactive decay occurs at the rate that it does. We have some ideas about that, but it's still undiscovered. There's still some undiscovered physics there, let's put it that way. If any one of your assumptions is wrong, you will get the wrong age estimate, and that's the point. That's the point. So these are some of the assumptions of radiometric dating. That you know the initial conditions, that the decay rate has always been constant throughout Earth history, and that the system is closed so that no minerals can move in or out. If any one of those is wrong, you'll get the wrong answer. And by the way, there's good evidence that number 2 is wrong. The Array Research Project did some wonderful research on that issue and found that number 2 is likely wrong. We know it can be. In fact, scientists have been able to speed up certain forms of radioactive decay in a laboratory by a factor of 1 billion. The rhenium-osmium reaction, we can make it decay 1 billion times faster. All you got to do is strip away the electrons, and it's called bound state beta decay. And you can look into that if you like. So, but here's the thing. We took some rocks from Mount St. Helens when it erupted in 1980. There were some subsequent eruptions, of course. And it produced brand new rocks from the magma. And that's supposed to set the 0 point on the clock. Because while it's magma, the minerals can move in and out. But then when it hardens, it's supposed to trap the elements, right? So that sets the 0 point on the clock. And we sent it in. We sent in some rocks and said, please date these for us. So we sent them into secular labs and paid quite a bit of money to have them do that because it's expensive. And these rocks came back with estimated ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years on rocks that we know are brand new. So here's the bottom line that I want you to take away. Radiometric dating has been shown to not work on rocks of known age. Secularists assume that it works on rocks of unknown age. Is that logical? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. So, here's the bottom line. We do find evidence of catastrophe in these rock layers. Fossils are evidence of catastrophe. This is a fossil ichthyosaur. That's a marine reptile that is extinct today, or thought to be. Killed, buried in the process of giving birth. There's a baby ichthyosaur being born there. They're born tail first because they're air breathers. How would evolution figure out to turn that around? That's interesting. But as soon as they're born, they have to swim to the surface and get their first breath of air. Pretty neat. But it was that was a catastrophic process. In the lower right, you'll see a fish buried and fossilized in the process of eating another fish. It doesn't take millions of years. Catastrophe. Catastrophe is how you would bury these things. Most things don't become fossils anyway. Most things decay into the environment. To form a fossil, you have to bury it quickly. And so fossils and these rock layers are evidence of a worldwide flood. And by the way, it doesn't take millions of years for rocks to form. Here's a set of car keys embedded inside solid rock. I don't think that rock formed millions of years ago. Here's a man-made clock embedded inside solid rock. How about that? That's the one rock we know right when it formed, right? Because it's got a clock in it. That's pretty neat. Or these layers, these sediment layers, some of which are lithified to rock now. There's a person down there for scale. Those didn't exist before 1980. They were formed in the Mount St. Helens eruptions. It doesn't take millions of years to form rock layers or fossils for that matter. So the bottom line is, when we take a look at these rock layers, we find it's, and we apply good observational science, we find it's very consistent with recent creation and a global flood. That would lay down these rock layers and the fossils that we find within them. Sedimentary rock layers are evidence that God did indeed judge the world with water. And that tells us that God is a righteous God. He's not going to put up with sin forever. God is a righteous judge, and he does judge sin. It's a reminder that we better repent as well, because there's another judgment coming, and it won't be by water, it will be by fire. And you can't escape that unless you're in Christ. So the real message of the rock layers, repent. God judges sin. That's the real message. It really is. So I hope that's been helpful to you. We do have a number of resources that I encourage you to get. My latest book,